Right. That is our cue to get started. Well, Jeff is out of town, so you're stuck with me this morning for better or worse. I'll let you decide that. But, y'all have run me out of like one-off Bible classes. So coming up with something this time was a little, it took some time, it took some thinking. But, so we're just going to tackle Colossians chapter 1. Is where we'll be and where we'll spend our time this morning. Colossians is a fun letter, in my opinion. Paul talks about some interesting things. The background with Colossae is also interesting and kind of what could be going on. What exactly is Paul's opponent saying in this letter? All kinds of speculation you can get into, thoughts, all that. We're not going to do all that this morning because we're just covering chapter 1. And even in chapter 1, we won't get into all the nitty-gritty in just the however much time we have, because Paul says a lot of interesting things, things that need exploration, depth, and detail, and I encourage you to do those on your own time, and feel free to ask me questions. We just won't have all the time this morning, of course. But to kind of get a quick and brief introduction to this letter, kind of what's going on and all these fun things, Paul writes this to the church at Colossae, right? I mean, that's why we call it the letter to the Colossians. But it's Paul's our author, so as you've read your other New Testament epistles, same guy, so you're going to see some overlap with certain other books and things as we go. Paul here in chapter 1 especially talks about Epaphras. Paul has a direct link to this group, obviously. He talks about Epaphras as his fellow servant, a minister of Christ. So Paul has direct connection here in some sense. And then this church is dealing with some type of struggle, I'll put it that way, against what's deemed the philosophy or teaching in chapter 2, verse 8. And it seems to have something to do with some type of physical restrictions, things about what they eat and things like that, and also the worship of angels, as kind of expanded on in chapter 2:18. There's not a lot of specifics given. Paul's more dealing with this is not what you're supposed to do, so let's talk about what you're supposed to do. But you do get brief mentions of it, though it will not really be much of what we're talking about this morning. I think chapter 1 is actually Paul establishing, here's everything that's right, and then he launches into chapter 2 with, hey, now let's kind of address this, but stick on to keeping the main things. So that's kind of my brief introduction. Like I said, we're going to be spending much time in chapter 1, so we're not going to get into all the nitty-gritty, but anybody have anything they know about this letter they want to throw out there before we kind of dive into the whole chapter 1? All right. Well, if not, let's get into chapter 1. Can somebody take verses 1 and 2? We'll just start with 1 and 2. Okay, yeah. So, Paul opens this letter up in a pretty standard way, what we would expect from a Greek letter, right? Greetings from Paul. But there's a couple things to note even here in these opening verses, right? Because first things first, is Paul by himself in this? No, he's with Timothy, right? This is kind of helping us see that, Paul isn't the only one concerned here with what's going on around and in Colossae. But also, this kind of puts you in Paul's life, right? Like, Paul's not always just tucked off in a tent by himself, writing these letters, teaching, thinking through these things. He has Timothy there, who he ultimately ends up writing a couple letters to, when Timothy's at Ephesus. And then, okay, I can't English apparently on my slides. Paul notes this is a faithful group. He highlights them as faithful, which I think is interesting because when you get into comparisons with letters like Corinthians, which is like Paul's sucker punch to the face, I think, for them in some respects, or Galatians. A faithful congregation, a congregation that Paul highlights is doing really good things. This is a different tone in a lot of respects we'll see here in chapter 1 than we see of Paul in other places. So that's supposed to say Paul notes this is a faithful church. Like I said, I don't know why I could not English apparently. So let's hop into the next little chunk here. It's still part of kind of Paul's opening. Can I get somebody to read, let's see, I'll get you 3 through 6. I'll get it.
We give thanks to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, praying always for you, since we heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and of your love for all the saints, because of the hope which is laid up for you in heaven, of which you heard before in the word of the truth of the gospel, which has come to you as it has also in all the world, and is bringing forth fruit, as it is also among you since the day you heard and knew the grace of God and truth.
So, Paul here, starting verse 3, gets into a thanksgiving section. This is also pretty standard for a Greek letter. You'll see this in other letters of Paul as well, where he'll be thankful, right? He says, I'm thankful for you, these things. Kind of, well, this is pretty typical here. But, I mean, I want to highlight, he notes that he's actively praying for this group, right? That it's not, for Paul, this isn't just somewhere off in the distance that he's unconnected to, and he's just getting them on the right track, and he's just here to thump them over the head, get them set right, and then he's moving on. No, this is a group he truly cares about. I mean, and even the things he's praying for, which I want us to highlight some here in a moment. It's truly like Paul cares. And you'll see that throughout, especially even chapter 1. He is actively wanting them to, do more, I'll put it that way for the moment. But it also highlights he's actively keeping up with them, right? Like I said, this is not some distant something that Paul's not really paying attention to, but he's like, oh, this is bad, I'm going to fix it real quick. I mean, Paul wants them to do well, and he's actively making and checking in, right? That's what we'll get into with Epaphras, right? That Paul has somebody there who he obviously seems to be in correspondence with. But the reason I highlight these things is a couple different reasons. I myself have not always worshipped in these walls. I spent time down at FC, as many of you know, went to Florida and worshipped at churches down there for a time. And then, came back, and now I'm here again. Like I said, some of you may be happy at that. Some of you are like, well, stay gone. But how often do you pray for the other places you've been? The other churches you've seen? The other churches you just know of may not have been. Paul, I think, did it a lot. I mean, he's doing it here in the opening of this letter. He highlights that they've been praying actively. And then not just that, how he's keeping up with them. I mean, I think this is a working model for how we should do these things. We actively pray for the other places we know. And we keep up with them. We keep eyes. We just see if they're doing well. I mean, this is how we build, the kingdom. We know what we have going on with each other. We have to keep up and pray for each other. So I just think Paul really does give us a little bit of an insight on how he handles that. And just to kind of go with that same thought, I mean, he starts talking about what the gospel has done among them, right? And I think this highlights the fact that they're faithful, that they've been, bearing fruit, all right? They're doing things. The way I kind of put this is the gospel's led them forward into good things. It's doing good things, good works, bearing fruit. It's not just been this stale disposition among them. And what I mean by that is, it's not like the gospel was declared among them. They all went, okay, that's what we believe in, and then just stayed there, right? They're like, okay, Christ is Lord. Christ is King. He has died, risen from the dead, ascended on high. He's vindicated. He is the Son of God in power. He is truly in charge of all things. Their question was then, what do I do? What is the next step? How do I go forward with this? And Paul highlights that about them. It's not this, I believe the right things and I'm done. It's, I believe Christ is Lord, now how do I serve him? That's what they've been doing. This is a good thing. And, I mean, the way I put it is they've discipled themselves to the gospel. They've become active workers in the kingdom. So, any thoughts on that little chunk of verses there? That's 3 through 6. Jeff.
Seems like he's kind of not the person who More like he's just heard about them from other people.
I kind of take it that way, especially with what we're about to read with Epaphras. It seems, at least in my reading, Epaphras is doing most of the work here, but Epaphras is tied in with Paul. So Paul's aware of them through, well, his, as he says, his fellow servant, Epaphras.
I guess my question is, do we know who started this church?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. Patrick, do you have?
I was just going to point out that he does this in a couple of other ones too, but how he notices these three words, beginning in verse 4, we heard of your faith in Christ Jesus, the love that you have for all the saints, because of the hope that is laid up for you in heaven. So we have those three words, right? This faith and love and hope.
Mm-hmm.
I think of it also like in the beginning of 1 Thessalonians, he brings that up again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Verse 2, 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, we give thanks to God always for you, constantly mentioning you in our prayers, remembering before our God and Father your work of faith, your labor of love, and the steadfastness of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. So, I mean, this part of this is being able to see certain things
Mm-hmm.
about a certain group.
Mm-hmm.
And what Paul points out here is that he's noticing their faith and their love and their hope.
Mm.
But the other thing that comes with it to me is that they learn the grace of God in truth.
Mm-hmm.
That last part of verse 6, right? Or was it verse 7? No, verse 6,
Mhm.
right? You have heard it and understood the grace of God in truth. Right? There's always that tie to, because he's going to deal with stuff there in Colossae that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that part of that's kind of later in the letter,
Mm-hmm.
but it's always coming back to what's the truth. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And how the grace of God is tied to the truth
Mm-hmm.
that God has demonstrated in Jesus, and ultimately people like Paul can come back and write to us about.
Hmm.
But we have to always come back to, we can think all sorts of things are the grace of God, but are they the grace of God in truth?
Mhm.
Or are they just wishful thinking on our part?
Mm-hmm. And the truth aspect here really does play a, like I said, we won't get, chapter 2, that's where Paul really gets into it. But I think to kind of go with what you're saying there about the grace of God and truth, I mean, that's what Paul kind of just lays out here in chapter 1, especially, I think, when you hit verse 15 for a certain reason. But he just lays out, like, this is the thing. This is what truly was authority over all things. If you notice the subhead, I mean, this is truly the truth. I know that's kind of a double entendre there, a little bit, truly the truth. But it's what is the foundational thing, and that's what Paul really highlights in chapter 1. It's like, okay, here's what, this is the basics. This is what we got to know. And then when we get, you get into chapter 2, Paul's like, okay, now we can start really interacting with the other piece. Okay, any other thoughts on this section?
In verse 6 it says, speaking of the gospel, it says, which has come to you just as in all the world, also as constantly bearing fruit. And then in verse 23 it says, if indeed you continue in faith, firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, for which I call and I minister. At this point, the gospel had been spread to the what the writers consider the inhabited world, which would be the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be a fulfillment of, like in Matthew 24, Christ is saying these things are going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
He says before this, in verse 23 of chapter 24, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to pull up his, verse 14 of chapter 24, it says, the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to the nations, and then the end will come. So at this point, that has been completed. It has been
Thinking through it real quick. I mean, Paul definitely sees his mission as part of getting the gospel. I mean, let's see, that was that verse 3, yeah, I think it is, yeah, 23. I mean, proclaimed in all creation, and then as you get into verses 24 and on, I mean, he talks about preaching it out to the Gentiles, right? I mean, Paul does see the gospel as this thing that's going to spread, and it's not, this is the big, I guess, controversy of the first century church, right? It's not just Jews anymore. Right. I mean, that's the whole thing there. I mean, when you get to like Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council, all these things. And so this is, I mean, in a way, Paul bases his whole life on this message of, well, it's everybody now. No one is excluded. There is no just, God. First century Jews were kind of mean in a way. I'll put it that way. They were very exclusivistic. We're in, you're not. And then, it's no wonder they put Jesus to a cross, because he's claiming, not anymore. The Old Testament's fulfilled. The blessing on all nations is coming. And I'm the one bringing it. And then, you get this guy named Paul, who starts off as Saul, as we often say, he's this persecutor. And then he changes all of a sudden, and now he's the one pushing the mission forward to the Gentiles. I mean, that's what Paul kind of takes his whole mission as. It's like, I'm the servant who's going to push it forward to the groups who have yet to receive it. So, I mean, it's interesting, too, if you look at Colossae as I guess, where it sits in the empire and things, it's probably mixed in mixed in a Jew-Gentile sense, heavily, just where it sat and everything. But any other thoughts? All right. Well, we're going to hop into 7 and 8. Who wants to tackle those for me? Just read those real quick.
Just as you learned it from Epaphras, our beloved fellow bondservant, who is a faithful servant of Christ on our behalf. He also informed us of your love and spirit.
So Paul here, Epaphras gets his shout out. He gets his highlight here, right? Because, Epaphras seems to be the active, I guess you would say preacher, minister, however you want to word that there, right? And Paul's kind of highlights, hey, Epaphras seems to be the one giving, I would think Epaphras and Paul, that's where Paul's getting his information. And I want to really note this. He calls himself and Epaphras, servants here. That's what the term he uses. And I want to note this, that Paul is writing all these things in, he's even here, the word servants, he's noting that it's not for their glory they do this. Actually, Paul, at the end of this chapter, notes he's suffering for all this. This is not something that they're doing to gain renown, gain fame, and do all these things, but rather it's for their master's glory. Right? A master, I think Paul really does work to identify in the middle of this chapter. But he notes that Epaphras is one and the same with him in this mission. So I wanted to highlight that. And like I said, I think Epaphras is also Paul's source for updates in this group and seeing what's going on and hearing of what Patrick knows, their faith, their hope, their love is all being reported to him from Epaphras, right? Because even there, he talks about their love in the Spirit. So I also did have a final observation on this opening section Paul gives us. It's very Trinitarian in its presentation. If you look from verse 3 all the way down through verse 8, you get God the Father, verse 3. You get Christ in verse 3. And then Paul ends this little opening with the Spirit in verse 8. You actually do get all three highlighted. Because you got to, with the gospel in its presentation, when you're discussing it, you can't have 2 or 3 or 1 out of 3. It has to be 3 out of 3. And Paul labels and layers his presentation of these things constantly with these thoughts. This is how God has revealed himself. And Paul, in his presentation, makes this a very Trinitarian thing. So I just wanted to highlight that as well as you look through it. It's easy to miss because, you're reading it line by line and it's like, okay, Father, but then you kind of put the whole thought together. You're like, oh, wait, 1, 2, 3. Jeff? I'm wondering what time period Wikipedia is talking about.
Well, probably not
Mm.
in the days of Paul, but it was a trend.
Well, you are touching on an interesting idea, though, as far as the ancient world. This is not 21st century America. We've been very westernized in our thinking because we kind of, they're worshiping rocks and wood and statues and things. But that's not the way the first century world worked. You walked up and down the roads of, here's, say, first century Colossae, you're likely to have, wherever this little church is meeting, take it as their building. And right down the road, you could have, let's pick one, a temple for Jupiter. And then next door to that, a temple for Caesar, because he's worshipped as God too. The imperial cult's a huge deal in the first century. And you keep going down the list, and then it gets even worse because you get all these little regional guys and all these house gods. And this is a world filled with quite what we would think of as idolatry. So Paul, in his discussion here, is like, hold up, we got to pull all that back and talk about the one who is truly in charge. And I think you're touching on something that's very real for them. There is a temptation to worship other things because we just, like I said, we can't just put this as believing the right things. This can't be a stagnant thing for them. It actually has to be very real because it has very real implications on where they go, who even bothers to accept them where they go, and if they, eventually, as you get on into the Roman period, if they get to live the next day. This matters in a very real way. Their world is different than ours because this has social, political, economic, you label it, every little aspect of their lives is affected on this. Who is truly in charge? And Paul is trying to encourage this group, you gotta know and you gotta stay here. Despite what you're hearing, despite the things outside. This is who truly runs all things. So yeah, Colossae probably does have an issue with it. I don't think Paul's just addressing something because, willy-nilly. So, any other thoughts? Okay. Well, that kind of wraps us up through the first 8 verses, kind of gets us in this, I think the bulk of what Paul's about to really start talking about in chapter 1. So, let's see. Can I get somebody to read 9 through 12? We'll do 9 through 12. Be the bulk. So, Paul here kind of gives a summary of what he's praying for more specifically for this church. And I think it's very interesting, the things he prays for. Because it's not material in a sense, very much so, though it has material implications, I would say. So, he prays for knowledge, wisdom, understanding. But it's not even just so they know more, right? The getting to know God, to learn more, to study more. It's not this thing just to be the smartest person in the room about God. That is the most pointless endeavor, if you ask me. If you're just wanting to study God, to know more about Him, just so you can claim you're the person in the room that knows most about God, you've missed the whole point. Because Paul is saying, okay, I'm praying for your knowledge. I pray for your wisdom, your spiritual understanding, all these things, so that you can go do things with Him. Be pleasing. Go forward in good works. Grow. He's wanting them to be strengthened. I'm sorry, you don't get stronger unless you exercise what you're doing, right? You see those people who go to the gym, right? They go to the gym to get stronger, but that means an active effort. Paul is saying he's basically wanting them to work the things, and he's praying that they grow in them. And yeah, he's praying so that they may be continued to do good works, to grow and be strengthened. Because, and as we get into it, it's all going to stem from what God and the Father has done among them by sending his Son and sending the Spirit. It's all going to be done with him in mind. But before we get into the next couple verses here, because I'm getting ahead of myself, because this is the exciting part for me. I really like what Paul starts in verse 15 here in just a moment. Any thoughts on what we just read? Okay. Can I get somebody to tackle 13 and 14?
Delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins.
So Paul here, in wanting them to grow and all these things, and how he's praying for them to do these things and do good works and be pleasing, he's doing it all with God in mind, because it's what God has done for them that's let this whole thing be possible, right? God kickstarted all this because he sent his Son in rescuing them, in bringing them into, I can't English. I was supposed to say reconciliation, I know it. But he brings them, he rescues them, he reconciles them to himself through his Son on a cross. And that's what Paul is so thankful for. He's wanting them to do good works because of what Christ has done for them. And so, it's in him they have the forgiveness of sins. It's how they are transferred, as being with Christ. So, Paul is then going to, in verse 15 here in just a moment, really lay out who he sees Christ as. But before we hop into it, any thoughts on 13, 14? Okay. Well, let's get into 15 through 23. Can I get somebody to read? We'll do 15 through 17. We'll start there.
He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things consist.
So, I think Paul launches into this. It's passionate in my reading, of telling who Christ is and where he now stands, basically. And with that, Paul really, I think gets into some nitty gritty. Christ is God and his authority. So, the first line there, I think it should intentionally make your brain jump back to Genesis 1, right? He calls him the image of the invisible God. Right? Because when in the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth, you get on down to verse 26, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Right? So I think Paul here identifies Christ as the perfect image, the one who truly did the mission that man was set on. Right? Paul even in Romans, let's say, describes Christ as the new Adam, the new image. Right? And then I think what really gets interesting here is he then talks about Christ's own role in creation, right? When you get into verse 16. For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible. Thrones or dominions, rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So, Paul, launches into the pre-incarnate Christ, right? That he has a role in creation. This is much like what John says in John 1, verse 10, right? That he is before, that Christ is part of the creation act, right? That, the Trinity is present at creation, which I think is very interesting. But the whole reason Paul emphasizes all of this is not just to teach us some really cool theological points, because Paul has a very clear message he's sending with it. Paul is using it, these images, bringing them together, bringing them to, line up with each other, because he's trying to emphasize that this is who's truly in charge. Like I mentioned it just a moment ago, right? They live in this world where there's a God here and there's an idol there, and you have to pay your dues to Caesar, and this guy over here, you have the senator here, whatever it may be. And Paul here is like, this is who's truly in charge, because without him, none of them even exist. So who's in charge? The guy who rules life and death, or Caesar, who's going to die? I mean, Paul here is saying things that, I mean, like I said, truly affect their lives. If they believe Christ is risen from the dead, that he is now king of all things, this is what it looks like. It's not a small claim in a world full of little gods. It's a big claim full of God, in a world full of gods who have no real power. So, before we hop into the next little chunk of this, any thoughts, anything?
If you go to Acts chapter 13, starting to see, I guess starting in verse 33, this is Paul's, one of Paul's sermons. He said, in it, we start 32 actually, said, we preach to you the good news of the promise made to the fathers, that God has fulfilled his promise to our children, in that he has raised up Jesus, as it was also written in the Psalms, in the second Psalm. You are my son, today have begotten you. As for the fact that he has raised him from the dead, no longer to return to decay, he has spoken in this way, I will give you the holy and sure blessings of David. Therefore he says in the Psalms, I think this is Psalms 89, no, sorry, it's maybe 110. I don't have the Psalm with you. You will not allow your Holy One to undergo decay. And maybe Psalm 16. For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid among his fathers and underwent decay. But he whom God raised up did not undergo decay. Therefore let it be known to you, brethren, that through him forgiveness of sin is proclaimed. It seems like in reading that, maybe I didn't read this, I may have misread, not read everything I wanted to read out, but that he became the firstborn in that he was raised from the dead.
Actually,
He was the firstborn of everyone who will be raised from the dead. But that's when he was called firstborn. It wasn't because he was born of Mary that he was the firstborn, although he is certainly the Son of God and preeminent there. But because he did not undergo decay and he was raised from the dead, therefore he is the firstborn.
and I think that's how Paul, as we get in here into Colossians a little bit more, actually he full well aligns with that. Right, he is the pre-existent son, but he's the firstborn from the dead in his incarnation, and then, death, and then, 3 days later, the best event in human history happens. And I think that full well, Paul here is pretty consistent, I think, right? Because with everything we just read about, he sees Christ as this authority figure over all things. You hear that as, say, a first century, Gentile, you barbarian, Scythian, whatever you want to be. You hear that and go, okay, that's all well and fine, but why do you think that, Paul? Like, what makes you so convinced that this Christ, this Jesus, is truly in charge, right? Like, and I think, here in just a few verses, we're going to get Paul's reasoning. But any other thoughts on 15 through 17 there?
From time to time, the topic of Satan comes up, and there's a misconception out there that he's like some eternal being or something, and whatever. And I say that because I put in my margin, I wrote the note here in verse 15 where, all things were created, that Satan was not an eternal being. He was created as well, as were the angels.
Yeah, no, you're...
It's a good place to go to if you're ever in that discussion about the eternity of Satan, or he was not there then.
He's no different than you and I in that way. He is created just as we are. It's only by the grace of God he exists, much less, everything. That's a whole nother rabbit hole we can go down.
People put angels on a pedestal sometimes.
Yeah. Whereas, and it's kind of funny you say that, especially what Paul deals with in chapter 2 and some things. The whole point is, hey, Christ is the guy. That is it. This is all you need to, is him. But any other thoughts? Okay. Can I get somebody to read 18 through 20?
And he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, and in all things he may have the preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in him all fullness should dwell, and by him to reconcile all things to himself, by him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross.
So, Paul then, mind you, he's talking to a church. And he says, Christ is the head. So he's encouraging the Colossian church here. Remember who's your head. Remember who's in charge of you, who you've brought yourself into. This is the guy in charge of even you. You have to maintain that. But then, and this kind of goes back to it, what's Paul's reason? Why is Christ in charge? Why is he authority over all things? It's not just that he is the one who created it all, but he can double down. He has more authority than that. He has more claim. Because as you get into it, Paul cites the resurrection as the event, the moment in which Christ is vindicated, is the ruler of all things. So, I want you to really, we've talked about it a little bit with the first century context, with things like idols and all of that. Now, think of the absurdity of the message for a minute in its first century context. Guys like Peter, Paul, claim that their God was crucified. This is a horrendous claim if you hear it in first century ears at first. Actually, I can't remember what it's called. There's graffiti of this. They're making fun of Christians for believing it. Offhand thinking. But the cross was this thing of shame and death and punishment brought out by Rome. They wouldn't even do it to their own citizens. That's why they can't crucify Paul, right? He's a Roman citizen. This is a torture and a punishment so bad they won't even do it to their own. And Paul and them walk in and claim, this is what happened to our God. But it's not just that. If you leave it there, it's kind of really a sad message. But Paul then launches into something like this where he's like, and he got up. They tried and they couldn't keep him down. He gets up 3 days later and if you control life and death, you control everything. Because unlike Lazarus, right? Nobody had to go get Jesus up. Jesus got up of his own volition. The Father and the Spirit, they all work together and Christ raises. He is up and he is moving and he walks this earth for 40 more days. It's not that he just gets up and it's just, okay, yep, all right, I'm gone. No, he walks around. Paul talks about over 500 people at once seeing him. This is not something that Paul is just vaguely making up. This, especially in its first century context, has real world people. These Colossians can reach out to people. They can talk to people. They're talking to Paul, right? Paul knows Peter. I'm sure Paul can hit them up with a gospel meeting from Peter if he really needed to, if they really needed the help. Because this is very real claims in their world. The resurrection truly matters because it's the event that changes everything. Changed everything for them. The big bad of their day, Rome, couldn't keep this guy down even with their worst. Now he's truly in charge. So, and then obviously the death and resurrection marked this moment of atonement and peace and reconciliation for them. Scared.
If you go to Acts chapter 17, Paul's in Marziel were very honest. They're listening to him, but if you get down to verse 31, it says, because he fixed a day in which he would judge the world in righteousness through a
Mhm.
This is, they were listening to him on the Areopagus. Actually, they had asked him to talk about
Mhm.
it. But when he mentions the resurrection, that's no.
Mhm.
It's not something that they were willing to
Mhm.
contemplate.
Yeah, it's in its world. I mean, this is a, I don't say crazy. Crazy is not the right word. Wild's not either. But it's a different claim. It's unique in its own way. And it's hard for some to believe. I mean, you see it all over. But it is, I mean, we can't get into all of it this morning. That's what I'm trying not to do right now. I'll just say this. The reason the church grows, especially for the first few centuries, is not because they're just such great like they can't just argue with the Greeks that well. It's just not the thing, but it's their conviction in this event, in the resurrection, that people start to go, there has to be something. We can't put these guys down. They keep getting back up. We kill 5 of them, and I think there's 10 more the next day. I mean, guys, Nero puts these guys on a cross to light a party up. And yet the movement still goes. This claim meant something so much it couldn't stop the church. Though the sneering, though the argumentation, though all these things, the church still went forward. So, to kind of wrap up this little section, as you can tell, I quite like this little chunk of verses. Here, start with me here in verse 21. Once you were alienated and hostile in your minds as expressed in your evil actions. But now he has reconciled you by his physical body through his death to present you holy, faultless, and blameless before him. If indeed you remain grounded and steadfast in the faith and are not shifted away from the hope of the gospel that you heard, this gospel has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and I, Paul, have become a servant of it. So we see that Paul here to this church identifies this. This is their reconciliation. It's Christ's death on the cross and their hope in his resurrection. This is the thing that has brought them reconciled to God. And that this is what they need to remain in. Because I want you to notice something Paul deliberately says here. Because the details in these things matter. Verse 23. It doesn't say, indeed you remain. He says, if you remain. They have a choice here. We've talked about it. They have options. They can go worship somewhere else. They can go worship another god. So Paul full well acknowledges that in his writing of here to them. They have choices. But I think he's laying out a pretty good case. Those other options are nothing like this one. Because this one's in charge of them. And if you want to really get down to brass tacks, this is the one in charge of them all. Truly in authority over all things. And Paul even says, I have become a servant of it. He's in charge of me. This is what it is. So, any other thoughts on this section of, just chapter 1? Like I said, Colossians is fun. You can really get into some of the fun stuff with Colossians. Okay, well, it looks like we may wrap this up this morning, actually get through all of chapter 1 in one go. Can I get somebody to read 24 through 26? Let's say, yeah. 24 through 26.
I now rejoice in my sufferings for you, and fill up in my flesh what is lacking in your patience with Christ, for the sake of his body, which is the church, of which I became a minister according to the stewardship of God.
So Paul kind of wraps up chapter 1 by bringing his own life into it, right? His life he now sees being propelled forward by Christ's life and resurrection, right? His hope in that. And talks about his own suffering and that he himself has become much like Christ, afflicted, beaten. Just think about it for a minute. Jesus, though Paul says he is truly in charge of all things, does Jesus just live this luxurious life when he walks this earth? Is Jesus just, sitting back at the temple like this is, technically my house. I can sit here in all the gold. You're supposed to bring me grapes and drink and hang out with his crown on his head. Is that how Christ comes to rule? No. Christ is basically homeless. He sits with the poor and the needy. He eats with sinners and those in need. And is even put to a shameful death. He does not come and live in the lap of luxury. Much rather, he comes and sits at the table with those in need. That's what makes him in charge of all things. He doesn't come and just rule over us. He comes and sits with us, brings himself down to us, so that way we may be with him. And now Paul's seeing himself in that own mold. Not in that he's in charge, but much rather he sits and comes where he is needed. That though he lives the life that Christ does in suffering the flesh, it's all for the purpose, as he calls the mystery here, that God is reconciling and saving. That is what Paul is after. And this brings us to the last handful of verses, because let's at least try to knock this out. Verse 27. God wanted to make known among the Gentiles the glorious wealth of his mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. We proclaim him, warning and teaching everyone with all wisdom, so that we may present everyone mature in Christ. I labor for this, striving with this strength that works powerfully in me. It's all for the spreading of Christ's kingdom. Paul finds himself a servant of that, first and foremost. That every lick of it, becoming like Christ, being formed ever more and more to his image, through the suffering, the pain, all of it, is so that Christ may be spread, be known. And so Paul here, through chapter 1, and I encourage you to read this letter and think through it. So like I said, this is just a primer. Like we didn't even get into all of that we could have talked about just in chapter 1. Paul here is trying to get them to acknowledge, above all things, Christ is the most important. That even Paul, somebody who they could revere in a sense, right? I mean, we talk about Paul in high terms ourselves, is second at best to Christ. And even then, Paul, I don't think, would say that. That above all things, Christ reigns over them. And that the Colossian church, and now you and me, need to keep that in mind in all that we do. So, Jeff.
Can I nominate a perfect bumper sticker? Christ in you, the hope of glory.
Yeah, pretty good one. It's a good bumper sticker. Though I didn't expect bumper stickers to come up in class. Well, any other thoughts, comments, anything?
Let's talk about, like Christ reigning over us and being more powerful knowledge of God, that's correct. Being reconciled, we've got to build a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Talks about more you in Colossians, how we're going to learn to be better Christians and some heresy that's going on. It's about building that relationship with Christ and prayer and devotion and learning and all those things.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're supposed to do today. So it's about that reconciliation, it's about building a relationship with Christ. They don't have to follow the angles.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. The one over all things reconciles himself to us. It's awesome. Any other thoughts? Well, if not, we got about 5 seconds left, so I guess we're done. Thank y'all for the attention this morning.